nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Shazza Jadala.
This week, the epidemic being fueled by the pandemic. Drug overdoses are soaring in America. We'll find out why.
As America prepares to pull out of Afghanistan, we're going to speak to a former US ambassador who says that after 20 years, it's still too soon.
We'll take you back to the triumphs and the tragedies of LBJ's Great Society.
And we're going to get the latest wheeling and dealing on infrastructure. But first...
The Delta strain of COVID-19 has set back American hopes of putting the pandemic behind them, at least for now. This week, the Centers for Disease Control issued a new guidance, not just recommending unvaccinated people wear masks in public indoor settings, but that in light of the Delta variant, fully vaccinated persons wear masks in public indoor settings in areas of substantial or high transmission. The CDC is calling for schools to reopen after the summer vacation, but that everyone wear masks inside school buildings. And earlier today, President Biden announced new incentives for workers to get vaccinated, including paid leave and a mandate on all 2.1 million federal employees and contractors who are to be vaccinated or forced to have 2 tests a week and wear a mask at all times. President Biden says these stricter measures are needed because this Delta surge is different, more infectious but less deadly because of the American vaccination program. Nevertheless, he says millions of unvaccinated people are vulnerable, so he's urging them to once again put on their mask.
We need to wear a mask to protect each other and to stop the rapid spread of this virus as we work to get more people vaccinated. And I hope all Americans who live in areas with substantial or high case rates will follow the mask guidance that's being laid down by the CDC.
Seems sensible, but that particular well was well and truly poisoned last year. The attending physician at the US Capitol building advised both vaccinated and unvaccinated lawmakers, staff and reporters to wear masks throughout the Capitol this week. We saw a familiar and rather depressing political battle over mask wearing then reignite. Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy tweeting, "Make no mistake, the threat of bringing masks back is not a decision based on science, but a decision conjured up by Liberal government officials who want to continue to live in a perpetual pandemic state." McCarthy's Democratic counterpart, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, was asked about that.
The mask mandate, Speaker Pelosi, any response to the backlash of the response?
That's the purview of the Capitol physician, the official capacity mandate from him. I have nothing to say about that except we honor it.
Leader McCarthy says it's against the science.
What do you really think, Nancy? Former President and COVID survivor Donald Trump also weighed in from his golf resort in Florida.
We won't go back. We won't mask our children. Joe Biden and his administration learned nothing from the last year. Brave Americans learned how to safely and responsibly live and fight back.
Well, of course, Chaz, as of this week, 611,708 Americans were unable to, as the former president put it, fight back because they're dead. And not only are case numbers surging again, but so too now are hospitalisations.
Yep, let's look at the numbers. Cases are indeed up to more than 60,000 a day again, which is right up to where they were at the peak of the second wave. Although obviously the third wave at the beginning of this year was quite a bit worse. Hospitalisations are at 24,000 now, which is up about 35% from a week ago, but they're still as low as they've been for over a year, so the vaccines are still doing their job there. As for the deaths, well, they've barely budged at all. They're still in the 250 a day range, so we shouldn't overhype that situation. Having said that, the case numbers and hospitalisations are probably higher than they appear, because Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota and Florida are helpfully only reporting their numbers once a week now rather than daily. Florida is a real issue because they're responsible for over a fifth of America's new cases. And as for hospitalisations, they have about 9,000 of them. Remember I just said it was 24,000 nationally, so that's more than a third of the national numbers. And it's actually worse than Florida's numbers from the big third wave. And closing in on their biggest wave of all a year ago. Florida is definitely the place doing it toughest right now, so their sporadic reporting is extremely annoying and cynics might suggest convenient. On the other hand, here's some good news. The Delta spike has a tendency to come and go. India was smashed by the Delta variant. They had pretty close to no vaccines at the time, yet within 3 months, the spike was gone. If we look at more vaccinated countries like the Netherlands and the UK, their Delta spikes have only lasted about 3 weeks. So America will be hoping that that trend continues. As for Kevin McCarthy's Liberal government officials wanting to live in a perpetual pandemic state tweet, need I remind you of the talking point that Republicans were rolling with before the election?
If it ends up that Biden wins in November, I hope he doesn't, I don't think he will, but if he does, I guarantee you the week after the election, suddenly all those Democratic governors, all those Democratic mayors will say, everything's magically better. Go back to work, go back to school. Suddenly the problems are solved. You won't even have to wait for Biden to be sworn in.
It was literally the exact opposite of what Republicans are now suggesting. But nevertheless, I do think it's worth breaking down the CDC's new guidance. Like John said, the guidance is for fully vaccinated people to still wear masks in public indoor settings in areas of substantial or high transmission. But that is quite a lot of counties, like 63% of counties. If we look at them on the map, they are the red and orange zones. But I'm sure the CDC have their reasons for this new guidance, so let's hear them. Oh, by the way, breakthrough infections are when vaccinated people catch COVID.
With prior variants, when people had these rare breakthrough infections, we didn't see the capacity of them to spread the virus to others. But with the Delta variant, we now see in our outbreak investigations that have been occurring over the last couple of weeks, in those outbreak investigations, we have been seeing that if you happen to have one of those breakthrough infections, that you can actually now pass it to somebody else.
Okay, so vaccinated people can pass the Delta variant to someone else, hence the suggestion to mask up in high transmission areas. Look, that makes sense, except on the same day that last clip was recorded, anonymous administration officials were saying that they don't actually have studies proving that vaccinated people are transmitting the virus. Their studies that they had showed that vaccinated people who contracted the Delta variant had the same levels of virus in their airways as unvaccinated people. So they were guessing that vaccinated people might be contagious. Now, this might seem like I'm splitting hairs. I kind of am, but this is exactly the kind of thing the CDC's been doing all pandemic. They leap to conclusions, they contradict themselves, and they create uncertainty where it doesn't need to be. And this is why it matters. About 86% of vaccinated people are confident or somewhat confident that the vaccines are effective against COVID variants. But a whopping 64% of unvaccinated people are not confident that vaccines are effective against variants. Now, what effect do you think it will have on their chances of getting vaccinated if vaccinated people start having to wear masks everywhere again? I would suggest it wouldn't help. And vaccines are what really matters, which is why Biden imposing a vaccine mandate on federal employees, that makes sense. Incredibly, as of July 11, 38% of nursing home staff were not fully vaccinated. And as of the end of May, 25% of hospital workers who had contact with patients were still not vaccinated. So getting those kinds of people vaccinated at least seems like a pretty good idea. California and New York have done a similar thing with their government employees as well. Apparently, only 43% of NYPD officers are vaccinated. But if all that still doesn't get vaccination numbers up, why not pay for vaccinations? In a recent Morning Consult poll, 43% of the unvaccinated said they'd probably or definitely get vaccinated if they were offered a $50 bond. $50, that's a bargain. New York has just announced that they'll do exactly that, giving the newly vaccinated $100 debit cards. So let's see how that goes. And don't forget, the fast approaching approval of these vaccines should make a difference as well. Not only would that make the vaccine seem safer to the hesitant, but it would mean that Pfizer and Moderna could legally start advertising. And that is an American-style game changer right there. America's pharmaceutical industry is seeing yet another multi-billion-dollar lawsuit settled over the opioid epidemic. Johnson & Johnson, as well as America's 3 largest drug distributors, have settled for $26 billion over allegations they implemented lax controls that allowed massive amounts of addictive painkillers to be diverted into communities illegally, as well as downplaying the addiction risk in their opioid marketing. Now, this all happened decades ago, but we're still dealing with the consequences today. Millions of people got addicted to opioids, and when the government finally cracked down on their overprescription, many of those people turned to illegal substitutes, hence ever-rising drug overdose death numbers. While they looked like they peaked in 2017, that unfortunately was a false dawn. And during the pandemic, drug overdose deaths jumped by over 30% to a record 93,000 deaths. Opioid overdoses have been a large part of those, also leaping up during the pandemic to 69,000 deaths. But these days when we talk about opioid overdoses, we're not so much referring to prescription painkillers or even heroin. We're referring to a chemical called fentanyl. Fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin, which means a fatal dose of fentanyl is a lot smaller than a fatal dose of heroin. It makes fentanyl cheaper and easier for criminals to transport, so it's often used to cut other drugs with. The result? Increasingly, opioid deaths are involving fentanyl in some capacity. During the pandemic, 83% of opioid deaths involved fentanyl, and the situation is getting worse.
Yeah, sadly so, Chaz. And for more, we're joined by Bryce Pardo. He's a leading drug policy expert and researcher with the RAND Corporation and the Brookings Institution. Bryce Pardo, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you.
So what would you say of all the many potential contributing factors are the main reason why we have seen an increase in overdose deaths during the pandemic?
It's a very good question, and we don't quite know yet because unfortunately the data lags will take about a year to kind of shake out, but there are a multitude of factors that we think are contributing to the rise in overdose deaths in the United States. Well, not only in the United States, but in Canada as well, and due to COVID. Largely, there's a couple components. One has to do with the social distancing requirements and kind of the stay-at-home orders. Individuals in isolation that are using drugs, it's just going to present higher risk of overdose, especially fatal overdoses. This problem is now kind of merging with the continued advance of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids in these markets. These are very potent drugs, and so when an individual is at home using alone, they're at greater risk for fatal overdose because there's no passerby to administer naloxone. They can't, in some cases, they can't access kind of treatment facilities or other kind of social harm reduction facilities that may be available to them prior to COVID. In addition to that, you do hear stories here and there of individuals that are, they may have had a heroin use disorder. They're in relapse for a few years, and then they lose their job because of the pandemic. And so they're at home, they're faced with kind of greater anxiety and greater depression, and so they relapse. And because the market has transitioned to fentanyl, they go out and they buy what they think may be heroin, and they use their typical dose and they overdose and die. So there's a kind of confluence of events, but it largely has to do with social distancing requirements and kind of this just general stress and anxiety associated with the pandemic.
Bryce, drug overdose deaths were heading up even before the pandemic though. So why do you think that might have been?
So in North America, what has been happening in the last 7 years has been the kind of march of fentanyl. Fentanyl started showing up in parts of the Mid-Atlantic, Appalachia, and in New England as early as about 2014. It has started to spread outwards, westward since then. Prior to that, it was largely contained to those regions for a few years. And then now we're starting to see it show up in major heroin markets in the West Coast. So Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, California. These are major heroin markets that for a few years were not impacted by fentanyl. But then starting in 2018, we started to see use indicators and drug seizure indicators point towards an increasing amount of fentanyl arriving out west. So what we did see in recent years was kind of an expansion out west, and for a brief period of time, we thought we were kind of catching a break in parts of the Midwest and parts of Appalachia. We did see a decline in 2018. But if you look at it state by state, the state by state variation, the increases were in states with already little fentanyl to begin with, and then kind of a decline, regression to the mean effect in some of those early impacted states. But that all disappeared. And now since 2019, just the numbers have continued to get worse, in large part because now fentanyl is taking over. In some state markets, you cannot find heroin anymore. It's entirely, these are fentanyl markets. And so it becomes an increasingly riskier drug to use because people, the margin of error in dosing is minuscule. We're talking about, a few milligrams in either direction can put somebody in an early grave.
Do we have any sense of what proportion of these overdoses is accidental and what proportion is intentional?
There are codes in the death records that do indicate that, but it is problematic because in this country, and this is a big country, and there are many jurisdictions that report to CDC. It's not just the 50 states. You have individual counties that will be, or cities in some cases, that do report to these state databases that then report to the CDC. And in some places in the United States, and I haven't seen the breakdown recently, but in some counties, coroners are elected officials. And they didn't have to go to medical school, and they are the ones that are deciding what code goes on those overdose death records. And in some cases, you hear stories of that. A coroner will say, in some parts of the country, they'll say, well, this guy, clearly this is a suicide because there's a track mark there and he's a needle next to him. So this was a suicide. Well, how do we really know that is the question. So really kind of digging down to whether or not these are intentional versus accidental is very tricky. But what we can say is that what is happening is the unprecedented, it's an exponential rise. The number of deaths involving synthetic opioids grew from just around 3,000 in 2013 before the latest outbreak of fentanyl to last year alone, we had close to 60,000. So it's a 20-fold increase almost in a period of about 7 years. And the stock of opioid users, the population of opioid users that have an opioid use disorder hasn't changed by 20-fold. And so we do think that what's happening is that these are accidental. These are essentially individuals that are running into a pill that they think is an oxycodone tablet. I mean, these things are made to look like genuine products of pharmaceutical grade or pharmaceutical origin. And so they run into these things, they buy them, they purchase them, and then they take them, and then they overdose and die. Because again, you're talking 2-3 milligrams can put you into an early grave. So it seems to be that that's the case, and not necessarily individuals that are kind of intentionally doing this to take their own lives. But that does occur from time to time.
Obviously, without giving people a how-to guide, Bryce, how would you say people are tending to get fentanyl in the United States? Is it the street corner drug deal? Is it something off the internet, the dark web? How are they getting it?
So through different means, it arrives to markets and into the hands of users. There've been several different vectors. In 2000, we don't quite know the share entirely, but we do know that there are different kind of supply channels. One is the direct to buyer, and here's where individuals can go online and pretty easily find a vendor or a purported vendor that'll sell research chemical or some sort of, in some cases, fentanyl directly or some sort of other non-controlled synthetic opioid. And then they can have that shipped to their house. And this is kind of a global phenomenon. Europeans have been seeing this, but not so much with opioids, but with other classes of drugs. That's one vector. Another vector is the darknet, whereby you have individuals who are savvy enough to go through the Tor and to get Bitcoin, can actually buy some of this stuff through the darknet. What we think is happening there is that these are other dealers in Europe or North America that are essentially importing bulk powder of fentanyl or other synthetic opioids, and then cutting that up into a retail level product, either pressing it into a fake tablet or some sort of other mode of administration, nasal sprays, and then selling that on the darknet to end users or to other kind of local distributors. And then there's this other vector, which is basically the most traditional one. This is drug trafficking organizations, typically the Mexican drug trafficking organizations, which supply pretty much all the drugs we consume in this country, with the exception of cannabis, which is now kind of homegrown. So Mexican drug trafficking organizations since 2014 have increasingly gotten into the space of fentanyl synthesis and trafficking. If you look at the year-over-year counts of estimated production potential for heroin, they have declined in the last 4 years. And this largely, we think, is due to the fact that the drug trafficking organizations recognize that fentanyl is just a much more profitable drug, and it's easier to synthesize. You don't have to wait 3 months for a crop to come to harvest. You don't have to pay a bunch of laborers to extract the gum, the opium gum, and then turn that into heroin. You can just do this in a lab in a few days with inputs from China. And so that seems to be where this is going. And increasingly so, we are seeing a lot of the law enforcement seizures at the border of a growing amount of counterfeit tablets that contain, a few milligrams of fentanyl, and the rest is just filler. And so it seems like Mexican drug trafficking organizations, according to law enforcement agencies in the last few years, is the kind of largest vector of, at least in terms of seizures, coming from Mexico. So no longer kind of the direct from China phenomenon that seems to have kind of subsided in the last few years, though it still seems to occur in some elements, not so much with fentanyl, but other kind of newer synthetic opioids. When it comes to fentanyl classic, it seems to be that this is largely the purview of Mexican drug trafficking organizations.
Bryce, does fentanyl have any legitimate use, or is it just trouble?
Fentanyl is a wonderful medication, and it has legitimate use. It's an essential medication. You're going to want it if you have any invasive surgery where you need to be knocked out. It is a great anesthetic. It was actually invented 60 years ago as an anesthetic, and it does have a very key role in certain surgeries. It's also used as a end-of-life pain therapy, especially for cancer patients who are just riddled with cancer and in a tremendous amount of pain. They need a very strong opioid to kind of reduce that pain. And there are other fentanyl analogs that are also used in these settings. So these are essential medications. But the problem with fentanyl in particular is that this is one molecule, but then you have potentially thousands of different chemical variants that can be manufactured by a skilled chemist. And some of these, we just don't know how potent they are. I mean, they can be orders of magnitude more potent than fentanyl. Take carfentanil in particular, which is it's an elephant tranquilizer. It is a regulated chemical. It is used in veterinary settings. And it's about 1,000 times more potent than, or 100 times more potent than fentanyl. And fentanyl is already 100 times more potent than morphine. And so, this is just orders and orders of magnitude more potent than what we've traditionally seen in drug markets. And so this is one of the reasons why this issue is just so complicated, is because the chemical makeup of these drugs just can vary from, week to week in some markets, given that chemists in China or India or elsewhere can easily manipulate these compounds. And so this is just one of the reasons why this issue is just far outpacing our ability to respond.
Bryce Pardo, great to hear your insights. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, John and Chaz. I really enjoyed it.
And Bryce Pardo is a part of a team of researchers who have been looking at the situation in Australia as well, and they're warning that we too are vulnerable to a similar epidemic of fentanyl abuse and deaths here. You'll find that extended interview online. This week, the House Select Committee looking into the January 6th attack on the US Capitol building held its first public hearing. It included previously unseen footage of the attack and included the moment the pro-Trump crowd of around 9,000 almost became a lynch mob.
They've got the gallows set outside this Capitol building. It's time to start fucking using them.
Start making a list, put all those names down, and we start hunting them down one by one.
4 of the just 150 Capitol Police officers who were there to defend the building that day and defend the election process while they're at it talked about the physical and emotional pain inflicted on them on that day, including Officer Michael Fenone, who was beaten unconscious and then suffered a heart attack as he defended the Capitol building.
It is essential that everyone understands what really happened that tragic day. During those moments, I remember thinking there was a very good chance I would be torn apart or shot to death with my own weapon.
We reported last week that Republican leadership had withdrawn the 6 GOP members appointed to the commission, but 2 others defied them to sit on this committee: Wyoming Representative Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you to our witnesses. I never expected today to be quite as emotional for me as it has been. I've talked to a number of you and gotten to know you. I think it's important to tell you right now, though, you guys may individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held.
And remember, of course, all of these members of Congress were in the building at the time of the insurrection, but the leaders of Kinzinger's Republican Party have dismissed this committee as a partisan sham. which is a bit rich, given they blocked the formation of an independent commission. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says he didn't catch the hearing on TV because he was, quote, booked in all these different meetings, while Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell didn't even have meetings scheduled. He was just, quote, busy doing work, Chaz.
Very, very busy bees, John, but at least they were busy shutting up, whereas Republican House Rep Elise Stefanik was busy trying to counter-program the hearing with this slop.
The American people deserve to know the truth that Nancy Pelosi bears responsibility as Speaker of the House for the tragedy that occurred on January 6th.
So it's all Pelosi's fault. By the way, even Fox News is happy to accept that Pelosi as Speaker does not directly oversee the US Capitol Police, even though she does appoint the House Sergeant at Arms. But the department is also overseen by committees from both houses of Congress, i.e. including the Republican-controlled Senate last year. Still, it gets even more depressing, with Representatives Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene and friends trying to counter-program the hearing with a press conference demanding answers on the treatment of the January 6th prisoners, otherwise known as the rioters. The fact remains, though, that Republicans will happily change the subject to anything else because they know their base is not on board with this thing. Only 32% of Trump voters described the events of January 6 as trying to overturn the election. Even fewer described it as an insurrection. But a majority of Trump voters described the events on January 6 as defending freedom and patriotism. So that's what Republicans are playing at. But what about Democrats? This whole hearing was a little odd because the committee has only just been formed. It's basically got no staff. They only announced their senior staff after the hearing was already scheduled, so they're not going to be able to follow up with very much in a hurry, but they did cram a lot in there. There was humour.
Some of our colleagues have been calling the violent insurrectionists not terrorists, but tourists.
Well, if that's what American tourists are like, I can see why foreign countries don't like American tourists.
They got their main argument against Trump in there.
If a hitman is hired and he kills somebody, the hitman goes to jail. But not only does the hitman go to jail, but the person who hired them does. There was an attack carried out on January 6th, and a hitman sent them. I want you to get to the bottom of that.
Okay, you got that analogy confused slightly at the end there, but you get the idea. And they squeezed a bit of searing anger in there as well from someone who was well qualified to deliver it.
The indifference shown to my colleagues is disgraceful. Being an officer, you know your life is at risk whenever you walk out the door. But nothing, truly nothing, has prepared me to address those elected members of our government who continue to deny the events of that day, and in doing so, betray their oath of office.
Still, the most important development from my point of view was actually away from the cameras. It was a letter from the Justice Department allowing former Trump officials to testify in an unrestricted manner without any claims of executive privilege. And recall, it was executive privilege that Trump used to grind officials' testimony to a halt during his impeachment trials. Now, you might think it's obvious that Biden's DOJ aren't going to claim executive privilege on Trump's behalf, but they actually have done so on a number of occasions already this year, much to the frustration of Democrats. So that's potentially a big deal for this committee, and they may well call another hearing sometime after their staff have moved into their offices.
Sounds like we're going to find out what did President Trump know and when did he know it, and what did people like Jim Jordan know and what phone calls happened. It's all going to be out there, which is going to be fascinating. Meanwhile, hope springs eternal for a bipartisan infrastructure deal this week, with the package put together by that group of centrists under the watchful eye of the Biden White House easily passing a procedural vote yesterday.
At a time when Washington seems broken, this group of members behind me came together, along with others, and decided we were going to do something great for our country.
Sounds encouraging, and key Democrat Joe Manchin seems to think this could be just the start of both sides working together.
When you see the bipartisanship here, bipartisanship is built because of relationships. Relationships are built when there's trust. And the more we continue to do things such as this, the more you'll see more bipartisanship.
Well, we'll see about that, Joe. This sausage is still very much in the making process. They've only just started to debate this bill. The amendments are going to come flying thick and fast, and then they still need to get 60 votes to end that debate, cut off a filibuster, and pass what is a $1 trillion plus bill. But, perhaps crucially, among the 17 Republicans who voted to take it to this next stage was none other than Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell. Observers saying that his backing signalled that his party was, at least for now, open to teaming with Democrats to enact this plan. And that's rankling former President Donald Trump, who's clearly not at all happy that his buddy Mitch is supporting Biden's infrastructure agenda after snubbing his for about 4 years. Politico reporting this week that Trump is doing everything he can to try and sabotage the deal, although some Senate Republicans are directly asking Trump not to just tone that down when it comes to criticism of this plan, but actually to support the infrastructure deal. Fat chance of that. Still, Trump issued a statement calling the infrastructure bill
a victory for the Biden administration and the Democrats.
And
a terrible deal and makes the Republicans look weak, foolish, and dumb.
And he warned,
don't do it, Republicans. Patriots will never forget. If this deal happens, a lot of primaries will be coming your way.
So there, you have been warned. Meanwhile, this week, President Biden agreed to an Iraqi request to bring America's 18-year combat mission in that country to an end. The announcement came at a White House meeting with the Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi this week. President Biden says that while the last combat troops will leave, the assistance mission will continue.
To be available, to continue to train, to assist, to help, and to deal with ISIS as it arrives. But we are not going to be, by the end of the year, in a combat mission.
Still, this does seem to be largely a rebadging exercise. Of the 2,500 US troops currently in Iraq, Prime Minister al-Kadhimi reportedly wants roughly 2,500 US troops in Iraq staying in their current form. Apart from the United States, Iraq's other main ally these days is Iran, and they are still very miffed that America assassinated one of their top military commanders, Major General Qasem Soleimani, last year. And that reportedly made the US presence politically impossible. Meanwhile, the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan is almost complete. Less than 6 weeks before the deadline announced earlier this year by President Biden, September the 11th, the 20th anniversary, of course, of the al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington. But the US drawdown has further revitalised the Taliban, who were ousted by that US-led coalition, including Australia, in 2001. A United Nations report this week revealed a surge in civilian casualties in the first half of the year, reaching record levels, including almost 1,700 civilian deaths, an increase of 47% on last year alone, Chaz.
Yeah, and it wasn't the most dignified ending either. They ended up leaving Bagram Airport by shutting off the electricity and slipping away in the night without notifying the new Afghan commander. He only discovered they were gone 2 hours after they left. And they aren't completely gone either. They're leaving 650 troops, Iraq style, to provide security for diplomats. But regardless, it's close enough to a withdrawal, and it's a popular decision. 73% of registered voters last month supported the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but will they keep supporting it if the Taliban immediately take over? Out of Afghanistan's 400 districts, the Taliban currently controls 193 of them, is contesting 130 of them, and only 75 districts are either under the control of the government or undetermined. Now, the government admittedly holds all the cities, which is noteworthy because that area was a stronghold against the Taliban when it was last in charge. And now the Taliban is moving in on Kandahar city as well, detaining hundreds of residents as it goes. America is slowing them down with airstrikes, but who knows how long those are going to last. Oh, and America have also promised to pay $4 billion a year until 2024 to finance the Afghan government's military, to go with the $89 billion they've already spent financing the Afghan military. Mind you, the Taliban has plenty of money of its own. It apparently raised $1.6 billion just in the last financial year through mining profits, selling poppy seeds, donating countries such as Iran, from exports, from taxes, or rather from extortion, and from real estate. They're moguls, John.
Very entrepreneurial.
Yes. Look, I'll leave the last word, though, to Joe Biden. He didn't even pretend that he was taking a lap of honour.
Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome. The United States cannot afford to remain tethered to policies created in response to a world as it was 20 years ago.
Not exactly mission accomplished, John.
No, they literally turned out the lights as they were leaving. Joining us now, though, is Ronald Newman. He's an esteemed diplomat who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Clinton administration in the 90s. He was appointed United States Ambassador to Afghanistan in 2005 by President George W. Bush. He's also the son of a former US Ambassador to Afghanistan, so he knows the country intimately. There are few, if any, people in the world with a better insight into this subject than him. Ambassador Newman, welcome to Planet America.
I'm happy to do it.
It does seem a bit strange to even be suggesting that after 20 years, it could somehow still be too soon to withdraw American forces from Afghanistan. But is that your view?
Yes, I think so. For a number of reasons. I mean, I don't think we should be having hundreds of thousands, but this business of endless war, you know, basically we had a counter-terror. What we were down to was a counter-terrorist mission. We had 2,500 troops there, very few casualties even before the Taliban agreement kicked in. Very sustainable for a very long time. In addition to the counter-terrorist elements, that also gave us a solid platform in Central Asia, an ability to stabilize Afghanistan, diminish the risks that Afghanistan would be a central area of instability radiating out into Central Asia, and was making, while not making the progress one would have liked, I would have liked, in a beautiful functioning democracy, we certainly were making a great deal of progress in terms of a whole younger generation that had bought into ideas of a free press and of democracy and voting and things like that, even if their system in which they were embroiled was still a bit corrupt. So I think there was plenty to stay for and plenty to lose by leaving. But obviously that wasn't the decision.
Now, Ambassador, my understanding is that the Afghanistan military severely outnumber the Taliban fighters, and the Afghanistan military also have the support and training of the American military. So if that's the case, why do people talk about the Afghanistan military like they're easy beats?
Well, I'm not quite sure why people talk about it that way. That's not my brief. They are certainly larger. They, of course, it's not arrayed like a nice conventional battlefield where the numbers tell, and you always have in an insurgency the problem that the government has to garrison everything and the insurgent can pick where they want to attack. In this case, I have to say the Taliban have been rather intelligent. They swung north. This was not an area in which there had been a great deal of fighting. And it was an area in which you had probably the weakest of the Afghan corps, too spread out geographically. Taliban took great advantage of that to race through a lot of very thinly held districts. And they've also cut off a lot of Afghan garrisons. And as Vice President Saleh said to me a little bit ago, he said, we have a lot of positions that we can defend, but we can't sustain, because when we, the coalition, pulled out all our air support, we left a lot of places where if the roads were cut, the Afghans have some air resupply capability, but not enough. And so this is isolated some. But the Taliban have not yet really challenged the Afghan army where the army is large, which is in the cities. And I think this is the set of battles that I think are coming. And they're coming pretty soon. And I think they'll tell us a lot about whether Afghanistan can survive. Quite frankly, if the army is able to hold on in most of the cities, then you essentially have a stalemate. and the war goes on, maybe for a long time. If the army starts to come apart and fragments, then that could snowball and things could end rather rapidly. And we don't know the answer to that yet. That's going to be fought out on the battlefield, and the armchair strategists and the academics are just going to have to wait for the result. Diplomats too, I might add.
So what is your expectation for the future from the US and its allies? Will there be significant support for the Afghan government against the Taliban in areas like air support, maybe drone warfare as well?
I don't think it'll be so well. What the Biden administration has said now is that it will not continue air support after August 31. We've decided our war ends August 31. Afghan war continues. Too bad for them. Afghans have a small air force. One of the big issues is whether we will provide the tech support to keep it flying. There's a lot of work going on to design programs to meet that need. So I think there's a pretty good chance that it will continue flying, but it's going to be very, very stretched. But you know, these things also are a little flexible. As of now, the U.S. will not put in air support. Will that change? I don't know. You know, if suddenly the Taliban are rolling up on Kabul and all the diplomats are scrambling, you could see a change. There's nothing written in stone that says we can't do more air support. Taliban have broken pretty much all of their parts of the agreement. But as of now, the answer would be no.
Have the Taliban changed at all in the last 20 years? Or can we expect from a potential Taliban government exactly the same things we saw in 2001? Like stonings, beheadings, the subjugation of women, and all that kind of stuff?
Well, they claim they have changed. They certainly have become more modern. They use technology very well. They use video, they use, social media. They're very opaque about this subject. So I think part of the problem is that observers tend to read into the Taliban what they want to see there. So the Taliban, on an issue like women's rights, Taliban regularly make this statement that we will guarantee women their rights under Islamic law. Doesn't have any real fixed definition, because when you look around the Islamic world, there's a lot of variation in how women are treated in Muslim countries. One can look at what the Taliban are doing right now in the areas that they have captured. And information's a little sparse, but what is coming out is closing schools, burning schools, requiring that women only go with a guardian. There's some really horrific stories coming out that are difficult to pin down. There was one report when I was there that in one northern area, the Taliban had said they wanted a list of all the unmarried and widowed women under 45 so they could be assigned husbands. That was a pretty horrific story, but the sourcing was dubious, and so I don't know. So the best you could say now is that we don't know. The worst is that it's going to be pretty retrograde, although it might not be quite as bad as it was before. But there won't be much left of women's rights, that's for sure.
Ambassador Ronald Newman, many thanks indeed for joining us.
You're most welcome. Thank you for doing it.
And a quick update for you now on a story we did cover in depth a couple of months ago. After the Biden administration announced that US forces would be withdrawn from Afghanistan, it soon became pretty clear they didn't really have much of a plan to keep the Afghans who supported US efforts safe in the aftermath. Of particular concern, the interpreters, who are now living in fear for their lives and the lives of their family as the Taliban retakes those vast areas of the country, Chaz.
Yeah, the Taliban has promised not to harm those who worked alongside foreign forces, yet surprisingly, reports are already coming through of ex-translators for the US Army receiving death threats, then having the Taliban shoot up their car, dragging them out and beheading them on the side of the road. America has responded with Operation Allies Refuge. That has actually already begun. It's supposedly evacuating those helpers who completed most of their visa process. But The numbers they're throwing around are like 4,000 Afghan nationals and their families, and we know there are a lot more allied helpers than that. And the lucky recipients of this assistance, who, remember, have a target on their back, have to make their own way to Kabul to get help. Sounds a tad inadequate.
Yeah, drop in the bucket, really. Lawyer Margaret Stock has been taking up their cause, and we asked her for an update on a progress.
So to recap the progress that we made, there has been progress since we last spoke. There was a Senate hearing on June 23rd, at which I testified, and also former ambassador, U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker testified, and we talked specifically about what the administration could do. We talked about the parole authority, the immigration parole authority, and how they could bring the interpreters out using that legal authority and how they've done that before. And then following that hearing, President Biden inadvertently said there was no legal authority to bring them out, but I think he was just getting some bad advice from lawyers who hadn't checked, because we discussed the legal authority at the hearing, and I have had documents at the hearing to show people how you do it. This is, basically the cookbook for how you parole people into the country in this situation. I had copies of actual evacuation documents for interpreters that were used under the Bush administration.
And Margaret Stock says with the 9/11 deadline looming, the situation has now reached a critical stage.
Well, I'm hearing from a lot of people that they're just going to flee Afghanistan and they're going to become refugees in some other country. So people who doubt the U.S.'s ability to evacuate them are already heading to places like Turkey, the STAN countries to the north. They're going to Pakistan in some cases. They're basically trying to go wherever they can go that will be safe for them. But there's a hardcore group of people that believe the United States will evacuate them, and they're hanging out and praying and hiding right now. I think it depends on the particular person's situation. I mean, some people, I have been telling them, I'm not sure that the U.S. is going to get you out in time. You need to be thinking of other options. But the people that are obviously scheduled to be evacuated to Fort Lee, that there's no reason why they need to go anywhere. The U.S. government says they're going to bring them to Fort Lee. So those 2,500 people can expect to be evacuated. But this is going to be a giant crisis. I think the administration knows this. It's going to send a lot of people fleeing, and we're going to have a civil war again in Afghanistan. I mean, we already have one. I'm also getting a lot of reports from people I know who are on the ground in Afghanistan that the Taliban are in fact murdering American supporters and sympathizers even as we speak. Gotten some emails describing specific incidents where they stopped the convoy and they just started killing people in the convoy because they knew they were supporters of America. The Taliban can't be trusted. They have lied repeatedly in negotiations. I saw a Taliban spokesperson on the news today. I was listening to a podcast and he was just saying things that weren't true. But they're attempting to portray themselves as being able to be peaceful and take over the country and share power, and everybody knows they're not going to do that. So it's a grim situation.
Margaret Stock there. And Chaz, this is also a concern for the Afghan interpreters who helped Australian forces as well, with former service members here also raising concerns that not enough is being done for them as well. Now, if President Biden manages to pass both a major infrastructure bill and a massive budget package on top of the trillions he's already spent this year on relief and jobs programs, he will automatically rank amongst the most significant legislative presidents in American history. Biden's 3.5 decades of experience cutting deals in the US Senate seems to have met a bit of a moment where federal spending is suddenly seen by many as an antidote to not just an economy ravaged by the pandemic, but also growing inequality threatening to tear America apart. More than half a century ago, during another time of social, political and racial unrest, another president seized on the moment to enact sweeping legislative changes, although many of those were ultimately overshadowed by an escalating war. This is the story of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. 5 days after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963, his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, invoked JFK's memory to urge Congress to pass the Democrats' stalled legislative agenda.
An assassin's bullet has thrust upon me the awesome burden of the presidency.
Lyndon Johnson was no stranger to the ways of Congress. Before becoming Kennedy's vice president, the Texan had spent almost 3 decades on Capitol Hill as an advisor, House member, senator, then rising to Senate Majority Leader.
I'm here today to say I need your help. I cannot bear this burden alone.
It was a call to action in the face of tragedy. It was also incredibly shrewd, if not downright cynical.
This nation has experienced a profound shock. And in this critical moment, it is our duty, yours and mine, as the government of the United States, to do away with uncertainty and doubt and delay, and to show that we are capable of decisive action.
And Lyndon Johnson had a long to-do list, starting with a civil rights bill to outlaw segregation and discrimination once and for all.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
6 months later, as civil rights was being debated in the Senate, Johnson delivered the commencement address at the University of Michigan, and there he outlined his vision for America and what he termed the Great Society.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
Yet passing the Civil Rights Act was easier said than done. Johnson had to do a lot of arm twisting to muster enough votes to overcome the longest filibuster in history, led by some of Johnson's fellow Southern Democrats. But in July 1964, he signed it into law.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
LBJ's Great Society program was just getting started. A week later, he signed the Urban Mass Transit Act. In August, the Food Stamps Act. He declared a war on poverty with the Economic Opportunity Act. Bolstered by a landslide election win that November, the legislation came thick and fast. In 1965, Johnson secured passage of the Voting Rights Act, outlawing poll taxes and literacy tests. Also in 1965, the most significant healthcare reforms in American history: Medicaid for the poor and Medicare for the elderly.
The new bill expands the 30-year-old Social Security program to provide hospital care, nursing home care, home nursing service, and outpatient treatment for those over 65.
Over the next 2 years, more than 200 bills passed on education, creating programs like Head Start, a massive housing bill, an end to discrimination in immigration. The 89th Congress also passed consumer protection laws, banning poisonous toys and deadly household items, and a law putting health warnings on cigarettes. The Public Broadcasting Act created National Public Radio and PBS, so we can thank LBJ for Sesame Street.
Hey, Bert, can you bring me a bar of soap? Yeah.
Many of the bills passed as part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program had been around for close to 20 years, but it took LBJ's political and legislative skills, the shocked aftermath of Kennedy's killing, a Cold War and a massive electoral mandate to get it done. And a number of those programs had a major and lasting impact, with poverty falling by almost half by the end of the 1960s. The Great Society wasn't just about improving the lives of American citizens. It was also designed as a counterpoint to Soviet communism. Johnson realised he couldn't call for freedom and equality in places like Russia or Vietnam if he didn't strive for it in places like Alabama and Harlem as well. But today, it is the escalation of the war in Vietnam for which Lyndon Johnson is most remembered. As it cleaved deep divisions in the American society, the Great Society was meant to heal. Look, Look, I hate to be the one to tell you, but that's your lot for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you back here at the same time next week, though, or whenever you like on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube.
Where you'll find a steaming hot pile of pet podcasts for you as well right there. So mind your step. Bye-bye.
All right.